Just when you think you've seen it all, this show pleasantly surprises you. Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 Episode 7 was one of the best action episodes across this entire show. It featured a fight which was ambitious in terms of its storyboards, versatile in terms of its art style, and incredibly strong in terms of its animation. The first half of this episode, aka the fight, was directed and storyboarded by Yuto, while the second half was storyboarded by Teppei Okuda and directed by Atsushi Nakagawa. And this staff list is extremely interesting. Nakagawa has directed episodes before, including one for this very show, but it was Okuda's debut as a storyboard artist. Okuda has worked on mappa projects before, and he's also a regular on certain JC staff shows such as Danmachi. What's really interesting is Yuto's contribution. He is really new to the industry. The first show he worked on was Sabikui Bisco, according to Anime News Network. That's a show which aired less than 2 years back. Of course, he had never done any directorial or storyboard work prior to this. The fact that he was trusted with such an important role implies that 1. He's incredibly talented, and 2. Director Goshizono encourages young talent and allows them to bring their own flair to this show. Goshizono himself is a new talent after all. Now, normally this is where I'd start talking about the episode, but there's one more thing I need to mention right at the start. Yep, that's right, the elephant in the room, the dimming and the ghosting. The ghosting mostly. What is ghosting? It's this effect where the previous frame bleeds into the next one. A ghost of the frame still lingers. Why is ghosting? That didn't make sense, grammatically speaking. Because of Japanese television laws. It's not something the studio decides to add. It's a requirement made by the TV station. Personally, I don't have a problem with dimming. Just turn your brightness up a bit. But ghosting really annoys me because it messes with the actual animation. This episode had a lot of both, and I will mention specific scenes which were badly kneecapped by this edition, but I need to make a general mention of this as well. And with that, let's go through this episode. Make sure to subscribe. The very first cut we see looks insane. It's animated by Kaito Tomioka, and just look at the amount of moving effects and debris here. Every layer moves. Mahito is constantly moving, both in general and relative to the camera. The scene goes from being an extreme close-up to one where Mahito is barely present. The ground underneath Mahito is breaking apart, meaning each chunk of debris had to be hand animated in a way which made sense. It also means that the animator couldn't animate Mahito the way he would if the ground was flat. Mahito has to interact with those chunks of debris. At one point, Mahito is perched at a near 90-degree angle. That makes this cut a lot more complicated. A few frames later, Mahito overtakes the camera and the beams. The camera catches up, but the beams don't, which is why the ground is now intact. Mahito is faster than the beams, but once he stops and prepares to jump, the beams catch up and the ground starts to break again. Such a well thought out cut with so many moving elements. Of course, the volume of effects was really impressive as well. The decision to make Mekamaru 2D was really bold. That thing is not easy to draw whatsoever. Gen Asano and Sakiko Uda were credited as the mecha designers. Of course, the design looked really good, and I don't think they sacrificed the movement aspect of it. While yes, every Mekamaru scene wasn't equally polished, at least it moved. And speaking of moving, this cut looks gorgeous, but Mekamaru moving at a regular speed while everything around him is frozen in time looks off-putting. Based on his movement throughout this episode, I don't think he's particularly fast, so it's probably not a flash effect. Interesting choice to say the least, especially because out of everything on screen here, Mekamaru is the hardest to animate and he's the only thing that moves. This cut reminded me of Gurrenlagann, mostly because of the cross-shaped multicolored explosion. Of course, this episode literally turns into Gurrenlagann later on. This entire fight had a Kanada/Studio Trigger-like look to it. Yuto's own animation style is very Kanada-inspired as well. The cuts here don't exactly flow together all that much, probably because of the difference in speed, but individually they look really good. The background here is hand animated. The fights this season are just as dynamic as the previous one, but instead of relying on subpar 3D backgrounds, the show uses 2D background animation, which obviously requires a lot more time. I don't know how they're able to pull off such a large volume of background animation. Love the shading on Mekamaru here. Of course, there's the initial layer of shading, but on top of that, certain sections of the body are blacked out, which gives it that ominous yet cool look. Also, notice how much Mekamaru moves despite being 2D. That is really impressive. The drawing quality throughout the fight was inconsistent. Some scenes lacked a finished look, but I can ignore most of it because of how ambitious everything was. This is an incredible shot. shot. The color work and the framing is really well done. Kosuke Kato's sequence looked really good. And yes, he is a Kanada-inspired animator, meaning his animation is often frame conservative and relies on strong exaggerated poses instead of fluid motion. But that's not always the case. Mekamaru's fist in this cut is largely animated on ones and its motion is insanely fluid with a lot of frames. This sequence was classic Kato, with those iconic kinetic lines and the signature speed lines. As always, the timing is very snappy, with hugely exaggerated poses and lots of foreshortening and stretching of models. Basically, the difference between two consecutive poses is very large. Look at the amount of moving elements here. You have the mech itself, the debris, the smoke, and the liquid. The more moving elements a scene has, the harder it is to animate. The foreshortening here is amazing. Mekamaru's hand takes up over a third of the screen, while his head, which should be larger, is tiny in comparison. This is done to help sell the idea that the hand is closer to the camera. Of course, it's a drawing, the camera doesn't exist. It's flat, meaning the animator has to imagine and draw this perspective. We also get this needlessly amazing bit of character acting. It starts off with this amazing eye close-up with a lot of detail. The eye is so voluminous. The shading and the line work looks top tier as well. The shot zooms out and the level of detail goes down. Of course, the drawings are still incredibly strong, but naturally, the close-ups are more detailed. You can see the veins popping out of his neck when he screams. Amazing stuff. This cut was badly affected by the ghosting, although it would have been difficult to follow regardless because of the way it's framed, but the ghosting made it unreadable. I had no idea what was happening here. I think the effects were Kanada-like, but I'm not sure. This cut, however, did look Kanada-esque. We got some Kanada light flare impact frames with the cross flare and the circle around it. Also, notice how the smoke simply appears. There's no smoke prior to the impact frames. We never see the smoke rise up or travel from point A to point B. Our mind fills in the blanks. That's an essential component of Kanada-styled animation. The style of smoke completely changes between these two cuts. It goes from the block-like Kanada-inspired smoke to that classic thick-looking Hayato Kurosaki smoke. Also, this sequence is a reference to the Evangelion series. A whole bunch of cross flares here. Also love the Etano Circus. That's the thing where a flying object is chased by missile-like bodies. We then get the scene which was borderline ruined by the ghosting. The entire background here was hand animated and Mahito runs through this 2D landscape while dodging the beams, but sadly you can't see most of it. A large chunk of this sequence is incomprehensible. The second half of it wasn't affected, so we got to see this insane bit of background animation. The shading and the proportional accuracy is remarkable. Atsushi Ikaria worked on this episode. He has never worked on a mappa project before as far as I know. He has, however, worked on multiple Ufotable shows. He directed Sabiku Hibisco, and episode director Ryuto worked on it, so there's the connection. A couple of his cuts were limited, but they were well disguised. For example, this cut isn't really animated besides the hair, but the framing is interesting to look at, so it's not an issue. A couple of awkward cuts here. The zoom into Mahito's face is weird. It isn't animated, which is why the line art looks off-putting. Also, the fist with the stock background lingers on for too long and isn't particularly impactful. Mahito flying into the mountain isn't exactly well drawn either. Needless to say, they couldn't animate the scene the way they wanted to. This episode did have quite a few of these awkward looking cuts with weak unpolished drawings, but who cares? Look how cool the action is. The show turns into gurrenlagann for a second with Kanada-like everything and those iconic speed lines. Mahito's domain looked amazing as always. Shinsaku Kozuma's work looked disturbing in a good way. The hands behind Mahito aren't actually animated. It's the same drawing being rotated layer-wise. The rest of the hands, however, are animated, and the volume of hands is really impressive. Natural-looking hand animation isn't easy to animate. They pretty much reused this cut from season 1. It's more zoomed out and the color and compositing is different, but it's the same layout. There's nothing wrong with reusing scenes as long as it's not overdone. Also, the original cut was so amazing, why bother? Although a couple of questionable Mahito drawings can be seen. Mekamaru here is a part of the background illustration. The amount of texture work significantly reduces when he moves. This is because such a large amount of texture work would look jarring in motion. Cool bit of camera work, you love to see it. Miwa gets a whole bunch of cool cuts, with animated zooms and lots of effects. Cool bit of morphing animation here, although it's not the smooth kind. The movement is choppy, but that gives it a unique look. The show then fully transforms into gurrenlagann. These scenes are animated by Yuto, who obviously takes inspiration from that style. It had that classic Gainax trigger style of character art, with the exaggerated facial features and the sharp lines. They even had the neon red glow. Look at these faces. Do I need to explain? This is such a massive shift in style from the rest of the show. I love it. It shows you the degree of creative freedom offered to the staff by director Goshizono. The effects turning into Miwa was such a nice touch. Also, they had the classic pencil-like line work on the drill, a direct reference to Gurren Lagann. And it's not just about the reference. Yuto's ability to replicate that style is really remarkable. Of course, the red coloring with the blue accent also adds to that look, but the animation does the heavy lifting. So many hands, so many effects, it's such an impressive scene. Also, the colors don't hold back. Everything is super bright and aggressive. The scene also had a lot of those signature thick lines. Mahito looked super sinister throughout this portion. The exaggerated faces made him scarier. This cut is the most Gurren Lagann thing to ever Jujutsu Kaisen. The red and blue colors and the copious amounts of pencil-like line work on the face. It wasn't a subtle reference, I'll tell you that much. Amazing drawings throughout the scene, very strong corrections. Also, classic visual storytelling. Miwa is in the light and Mekamaru is in the shadow, aka the darkness. The crowds were 2D, another bold choice, especially because it's Halloween, meaning most people are in costumes, meaning every character design is more detailed than usual and different from one another. It's very difficult to draw, basically. The crowd scenes were presumably animated by Takafumi Mitani, and if simply animating them hanging out wasn't difficult enough, they decided to animate this scene where they fly past the camera. The ones at the very back aren't animated separately, they are instead presented like morphing pillars of flesh. But the ones closer to the camera are drawn individually, and I just told you why that's so impressive. Also, a lot of them move differently, which only adds to the complexity of the scene. Love the general style of drawing with the loose artwork. And that just about does it. This video will probably be a longer one, but hey, this episode deserved it. Yes, it lacked polish at times. Yes, some of it wasn't what it could have been, but overall, it was ridiculously impressive with so many styles and so many ambitious cuts. I loved it if you couldn't tell. Also, fuck ghosting. That's about it. Did you like this video? Check out this other bit of content. If you did, like and subscribe, and until next time.